the previous stuff, just this. So what we need to do is we need to set up our folder. So just like in the intro class or any other Maya class you may have taken, we need to set up our preferences, okay? So on the P drive, we're going to make a new folder, and you're going to call that your last name underscore W2016. Okay, so for me it was Sarcona underscore W2016. Inside there you'll make another new folder called 2540. Okay, the work folder is your folder to save all the work that you're doing. So when you create a Maya file or a project, you want to put it inside the work folder. If you download a reference video, like you enjoy those 12 principles of animation, you want to have a copy of it, whatever, you can store that inside your source folder, something to reference back to. Or you have the link to the YouTube video inside your source folder to always be able to jump back to that. Okay? Everything in work is just going to be the actual stuff that we are going to build. So now we're going to jump back to the P drive. And on the P drive, there should be a 2016 folder. In my folder, it's not there because I've already deleted it, but we want to delete the 2016 folder. Okay, that's the preference folder from the class before this. Okay, so those delinquents in the intro class that left their 2016 folder there, we want to get rid of it. We want to start fresh. Okay, your preferences are going to be something that you're going to set up and you're going to manage throughout this entire class to make sure that your stuff is always working. If you have Maya up, it will not let you delete that 2016 folder, so just be aware of that. Once all that's done, you can boot up Maya. So Maya's booted up. We have a what's new highlight section. We can I turn that off. I don't need to see the pop-up every time I start Maya. And then if it's been a while since you've been in Maya, you may want to take the weekend to just kind of reacquaint yourself with Maya. Okay? The first thing we want to do is we want to go to the custom shelf. So on the shelving area, there's a custom tab. We want to go to the custom tab and we want to add in our own preferences. Okay? So there's certain things that we're going to constantly be jumping to animate stuff, to edit keyframes, to do whatever. So the hotkey is Control-Shift. So you hold down Control-Shift, and then you go to a menu item, and you can add stuff to your shelf. So I'm going to hold down Control-Shift. I'm going to go to Edit, Delete by Type, and I'm just going to click on the word History one time. And then let go, and just click back in my viewport. Okay? So I've added the Delete History button to my shelf. You hold Control-Shift, Edit, Delete by Type, History, and then click off, and then you should have in your shelf a history button. Okay? So this is how we can very quickly delete history on an object. We're going to hold Control-Shift again. We're going to go to Modify, and then we're going to go to Center Pivot. Okay? So Control-Shift, Modify, Center Pivot. It's near the top-ish. Then we can have a Center Pivot button in there. Another one we want to add is Freeze Transform, which is right above that. So we go to Modify, Freeze Transform with the Center Pivot, or with the Control-Shift clicked, and then that one will be up there. Okay? So we should have Delete History, Center Pivot, and Freeze Transform. If I go too quick, tell me to slow down.
How do you delete them from your document?
There used to be a trash can, but now we can just right-click and go to Delete. Much simpler. Okay, so we have Delete History, Center Pivot, and Freeze Transform. Now what Delete History does, if you don't remember, is if you, let's say you modeled something and you have all this stuff, you extruded, beveled, inserted edge loops, it eliminates all that stuff. So you basically just have a flat object. Now what it also does is, let's say we animated the fish and we had the fish moving his tail back and forth, and then we deleted the history, that animation stops. Okay? Because all the stuff that we did to the fish to get him to be able to move was because of history. So in this class, we have to be very careful of what we're deleting history on. All right? Center pivoting will move the pivot for us to the center of the object. Some cases we want it to do that. Some cases we will manipulate it and move it exactly where we need it to happen. The freeze transform allows us to reset what our translates are, okay? So just watch up here on mine, and if I created a sphere, let's say, and I moved it here, I scaled it, and I rotated it, and I said I want this sphere to be right there. But I don't want all of these things to be I want all of these to be 0 and 1 again. I want everything to just go back to those default settings. That's where I would use my freeze transform to reset all of that back to 0 and 1 while keeping my object right where it's at. Okay? So sometimes we want that to happen. That's why we put that there. Now in a lot of these we can go to the option box too, and we can edit this to say just do the translates or just do the rotates or just do the scales. Okay? So just be aware of that as we progress. All right, so those three are cool. Control Shift, and we're going to go to Window, Animation Editor, and we're going to add the Graph Editor and the Dope Sheet. And while we're at it, the Expression Editor. Okay, so Control Shift, add the Graph Editor, the Dope Sheet, and the Expression Editor. Okay. These three things serve a very specific purpose of why we would go into each one of these. The Graph Editor allows us to edit not just the points and where they're located, but we can also control the velocity. So in the videos, when he was talking about changing it from a linear, like a straight curve, into creating these like rounded ones that have the ease in and ease out, that's where we could do that. It's inside the Graph Editor. In the Dope Sheet, we merely deal with spacing of keyframes. So let's say I have a keyframe here and a keyframe there, and I just want to move these keyframes closer together. I could do that in the Dope Sheet, okay? Or if I have 100 objects and I just want to see all of their keyframes together and adjust them all at the same time without seeing a big cluster, I could adjust it in the Dope Sheet, okay? And then the Expression Editor, this is where we can actually type in an expression, a little mini program, and it'll automatically animate stuff for us. So just to kind of showcase what that is, because you probably haven't seen anything like that, I'm going to put my pivot, come on, there we go, up here, and I'm going to go to the Expression Editor, and I'm going to say p sphere 1 dot rotate z equals the sign. Okay. There we go. So now if I hit play, oh, that's too quick. Let's go a little bit slower. There we go. Okay, so now this animation is just making this sphere do this little arcing pattern. So instead of me actually setting keyframes for here and then having to loop that, I've just created an expression that would do that automatically. Okay, so you can think about anything that has this kind of patterned animation, I can do it to it like that. Okay, I could also do some random stuff. So I could just make this a random number between negative 360 and 3. Doesn't matter, but whatever. Okay, there we go. So now you see it's just a random spot. It's just picking this random spot around here. And then I could also use more advanced stuff as we get into this. Time slider, perfect. Let's say 30. There we go. So now what I've done is I've taken that expression and converted it to keyframes. Okay? But I've only converted it to keyframes every 30 frames, so it gives me this kind of like arc pattern over here. So there's a lot of stuff that we can do. It's just a matter of how do we do it.
Is there somewhere that there's like a list of like the basic commands for expressions?
There is inside here. If we right click, there are some, where are they at? Right here, some math functions, random functions, vector functions. We actually used to have, I don't think I have it anymore. No. There's a book that we used to have. It was like this thick, and it was all about how to write expressions. In this class, you're going to write expressions, okay? Because what it allows you to do is connect things very easily to other things. All right, so I could actually say, while this thing's spinning like this, I want this other object to do this. And while that's doing that and this is doing this, I want this other object to do that. Okay, so very easily we can connect things. So you'll see just very basic how we can do it. Apart from this class and apart from other areas to kind of search and see what other expressions are, it's really just kind of like, here's what I want to do. Eventually you'll hit this spot where you're like, I want this to do this specific thing. How do I do that? And then you search for Google to figure out how to do that specific thing. There you go. Linking, rotate, and translate X, how you do something specific like that. I just got an email from another student from years ago who said, if I'm making, eventually I figured out, he's like, I'm trying to redo BB-8. How would I link it so that as he's rotating, I can get his head to follow it and kind of have some overlap and whatever else? That's like really long expression stuff, okay? When we get into doing rigging is where we're going to use expressions mostly. When you get into seeing the character rig, their expressions are enormous. They have like pages of expressions to make their rig work the correct way. So you'll see some of the basics and where you can kind of take it from there. All right, so we have graph editor, dope sheet, expression editor. Control shift click again, and we're going to go to window, attribute editor, and outliner. Okay. Now those 8 items right there should be a good foundation for what you're going to be doing. Anything else apart from those 8, feel free to add in there. If you're like, I'm constantly going here, here, and here, add that into the mix, okay? This is your shelf. This is your way to make sure that your Maya is working as efficiently as possible. So if you find I'm always going over here to curves and to unlock length, I don't even know what that does, there it is, okay? All right, so that's that specific thing there. Now we're going to come down here. See the little gear guy way down here on the right? We're going to click on the little gear guy. Okay? Because in here, before we do any animation, we have to set up Maya to say that we're going to do animation with certain settings. So under the settings here, we want to tell Maya what kind of animation we're doing. So right now it's set to film 24 frames per second. For this class, I want us to work on NTSC 30 frames per second. Okay, now what that gives us is it gives us 6 extra frames per second. Okay, so something like a bouncing ball, we have more frames to deal with, so we can add more animation per second there. Okay, so think of like, if you're watching those slow-mo guys videos on YouTube, where they take something like a water balloon popping and they shoot it at like 10,000 frames a second. If it was shot at 30 frames a second, you wouldn't see anything happen. But at 10,000 frames, you see every bit of that latex wrap around that water, and then each water pellet kind of drop, okay? So the more frames you have, the more detail you can add to that. Now 30 is a good number to go with. That's typically what you would have shown on like a TV. If you're in a video game, you might be at 15. If you're in England or across seas, you would be at like 25. Okay? So 30 is a good one to go with. Remember to change this setting before you do any animation and not after, because then that moves stuff around. So that's going to stay there. Underneath the time slider area, our playback speed is set to play every frame. This is neat, but for animation it's not, because what happens is we hit play and it plays back every frame, but it might play back super fast or it might play back super slow. What we want to do is see this thing in real time. Okay? We want our animation to play back in real time so that we can see exactly how fast this thing is going. All right. Now those are the only 2 things that we need to change. I'm going to show you one more thing if you want to change it, or 2 more things if you want to change it. Number 1 is the amount of undos. So if you think that you're going to need more than 50 undos, you may want to up that. I wouldn't go any higher than 200, but you may want to up that to 200 if you're someone who is constantly going back like a lot. Okay. 50 for me is fine. So if you want to, you can set that. The other spot you may want to set is under files and projects. So how many people have ever had Maya crash on them? Why isn't everyone's hand up? So inside Maya, you can actually set, I want autosave. Okay, and that's what this is right here. You can enable autosave, and every 10 minutes, it'll automatically save your file to the hard drive under a different name. Very, very handy if you don't want to lose your work, or at least 9 minutes of your work. Okay, so if you check that, you can set that to 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever you want. I typically don't care. If I've done something, I can typically get back to that last part pretty quickly. There are times I do care, but most of the time I don't. Okay, so I'm going to leave mine off. I'm going to hit save, and then we'll be good. All right, so after we hit save, you may notice that your time slider on the bottom, it doesn't say 1 and 1 anymore, which is what it used to say. It now says 1 and 1.25. When we went from 24 frames a second to 30 frames a second, that's when that happened. So we just need to reset this back to 1. And then our far right numbers here, we can just set this to 100 and 100. Okay? So just so you can see what these are, this number right here on the far left and this number here on the far right, those two numbers are the length of time your animation is. Okay? So if I'm dealing with a scene in a movie, I may have 6 seconds, 6 times 30 frames a second, I have 180 frames, right? But in that 180 frames, I may only be focusing in on 20 or 30 frames. That's where this number here and this number here come in, those inner numbers. If I set this to, let's say, you don't have to do this part, 50 and 80 or 90, you can see how my time slider is locked to 50 and 90, but I still have the rest of that animation there, okay? Now, changing this doesn't eliminate stuff. So if I accidentally shrunk my entire thing to 2 frames, all the keyframes are still there for everything. It's just a matter of what I'm seeing. So I'm just going to pull this back out. Now, I typically, very rarely, will I use this for the animations we're doing in this class, except for when we get to the end stuff and where animations are a bit longer. When we're dealing with like 1,000 frames, I probably condense that to maybe 100 frames and focus on maybe 100 frames at a time. Okay? All right, so now let's do something. Let's make a new project. So let's go to File, Project Window. Okay, remember this from the intro class. We have to make a project every time we start doing an animation. So I'm going to make a new project, and I'm going to call it Playing Around _ Sarcona. Okay, so File, Project Window, click the New button, and give it a name. Make sure your name is inside there. For the location, pick your work folder. Okay? Every time you make a new project, every time you're working on something brand new, you go to that File, Project window, you click New, give it a name, give it a location, and then you hit Accept. When you come in every day, you go to File and you go to Set Project, and you tell it which project you're working on. I'll remind you next week, I'll remind you the week after, but after that, you're on your own to remember, okay? Especially for animation stuff, it happens that when people hit render, render it out, it takes 2 hours, 3 hours, 8 hours, however long, and they look at that final project or that final rendering and everything's black because all the textures didn't load. All the stuff they thought was there wasn't there anymore. So we make sure we set our project every time. Just to show you this so you can see it again, File, Project window when you're making a brand new project, and then File, Set Project when you're trying to tell it, I'm working on this project. You have to do that every single time you open up Maya. Okay? So when you go home, you set your project. When you come here, you set your project. If you're in 2 classes and you're working on stuff from the modeling class, you set your project to that. When you're working on stuff for this, you set your project to this. Okay? All right, so now let's make a sphere. So create a polygon sphere. And what we want to do is we want to animate the sphere going from one side to the other side. Now, realistically, it does not matter that my sphere is actually below the grid. It does not matter. However, it matters to me that my sphere is below the grid. I don't want it below the grid. I want it sitting on the grid just like the grid was a ground. So if I go to my translate Y and I move it to 1, the sphere pops up right on top of the grid. Now the other thing that I don't like about this is that my translate Y now has a 1 in it. I want that to go back to 0. How do I get it back to 0? Freeze transformation. So we just click freeze transformation and now everything is cool. Okay? Now we also don't need the history for this. I'm not doing anything history-wise for the sphere, so I can also just delete the history just so I don't have to look at it. All right? So I moved it on top of the grid. We froze transformations, deleted the histories, and now we're good to go. So my history button. So edit, delete by type history if you didn't have that button there, but I think you do. All right, so now we want to animate. Now, one of the issues that people that start off animating stuff is that they click set key, and set key sets keys for every single thing that's shown, okay? So if we're animating one property, which we're going to be doing initially, we don't need to set keyframes for everything. So stuff like our translate X, this is what we're going to animate. You can see that it doesn't move anything else. It just moves this translate X here. So I'm going to set my translate X to -12. So set your translate X to -12. And you'll see that it moves that sphere to the back side of the grid. So it's actually like right on the grid. Here's one way we can set keyframes just on translate X. I right click on the word translate X and I key the selected item. Okay, so right click right on the word translate X and then key that selected item. All right, now I'm going to go up a bit. So I'm going to go up to frame 100 here. Set my translate X to +12 and then right click and key selected again. Okay, so if we were to hit the play button, if you look at your hotkey sheet, I think it's on there, it says Alt V maybe somewhere. That's the play button. I didn't put, no, I didn't put that one on there. Okay, so Alt V is your play button so that you can see this animation going across. And if you look at it, it looks like it's a pretty static animation. It doesn't look like there's any acceleration going on. It looks like it's just going from A to B, from -12 to +12, and that's it. Now, what we need is if we added a little bit of easing in here so that we had some interest on this sphere. Okay? So that's where we're going to use the graph editor. So we're going to click on our graph editor button, hit stop, and then go to the graph editor button. And there is some easing happening. If we look at this graph, there is some ease happening on this, but it's so subtle we really can't tell that it's happening. So what we can do is maybe exaggerate the ease of this. So this graph editor, it works a little bit tricky, and you just have to kind of play with it a little bit until you're comfortable with moving stuff around. So with the move tool, just the regular W move tool, I'm going to marquee this first keyframe. Okay? Then I'm going to marquee this handlebar, and then I'm going to middle mouse button click and drag. Okay? So I marqueed this point first to highlight it, then I marqueed this handlebar, and then I just middle mouse button click and dragged to drag that handlebar upwards. Okay? So now instead of having a slow in, acceleration, slow out, what we should have here is really, really fast and then super slow. The steeper this is, the faster it's going to go. The shallower it is, the slower it's going to go. So you can throw that off to your other screen. Yes, ma'am?
I, for some reason, don't
Do you have your sphere clicked? There we go. Yes, make sure you have your item clicked, because if we had 20 objects in our scene, it would only show us the objects we have selected. Okay? So now if we were to hit play, we'll see that we have a little bit of a different animation happening here. He accelerates pretty quick right away. And then at the very end, he slows down. At the last 25 frames or so, he's only moving like one block, if that. Okay? So you can see how we can change the speed of this ball, not by adjusting the keyframe's position, but just by adjusting those handles. So I'm going to stop the animation, and I'm going to reverse that. So I'm going to move this one back to being flat. I'm going to grab the other one just by marking the handlebars and bring that in. Now I'm being careful that I don't bring this bar, this white bar, below that line, because if I do, what would happen is the ball would actually shoot past it and then come back, which would be weird. Okay, so now if I hit play, you'll see how slow he goes and then how fast he accelerates at the end. Okay, because that first part of that graph is pretty shallow. Okay, you can see there's not much movement here at the first part of this, and then he ramps up and goes obviously a lot quicker. Now we have also inside the graph editor, I'm going to make this bigger so we can see it, we also have these buttons up here, and these are kind of the default settings for these handlebars. So if I grab the entire graph, like so, and I click on these buttons here, I'll get different results. Some of them will give me different results. So you'll see like these two, I get completely different results. Okay? But this one, and actually this one are giving me the same results. All right? Some of these you're going to see more of an impact when you have multiple keyframes going on. Because we only have 2 keyframes, it's not changing our graph a whole lot. All right? So this one here, when this goes from this point to that point, and these handlebars are in a straight line, that's called linear. That means that there's no acceleration, no deceleration. So if I hit play, you'll see how static this is. And it's actually much more boring than the original one was. If I click on this flat one here, we're going to get the original setting that we had. We're going to get a little bit of speeding up and slowing down at the start and the end of this. If I choose this one, we get no movement at all until the very end. Okay? This is called stepped. So there's no movement, and at the very end, that very keyframe, it jumps to that spot. So something like, imagine we had a light, and we wanted that light to be super bright, and then we wanted to just kill the light. Okay? We could go to this keyframe and set a key that it's, let's say 100 for the intensity, and then go right next to it and set it to 0. Or we can say it's 100 here, 0 here, and it's a stepped keyframe. And that would do the exact same thing, just kill the light at that point. Okay? So a lot of times what I do is I'll use these up here just as a way to get just a base setting. Okay, so I'll grab a bunch of stuff, I'll set the base, and then I can go through and start to play with them. Now if we look at the handlebars too, this only gives us a little bit of, let me stop this, a little bit of manipulation. What if I really, really, really wanted to exaggerate this movement here? What if I really wanted to go super slow and then speed up and then go super slow again? What if I wanted that to happen? So these handlebars, if you kind of click and drag with the middle mouse, you see they don't stretch out. Okay? They do, we just have to turn options on to allow them to stretch out. So marquee your graph, and under tangents, say free tangent weight. Oops, sorry. Under curves, go to weighted tangent first. There we go. So grab your stuff, go to curves, weighted tangents, and then under tangents, go to free tangent weight. Okay? It's a 2-step process. Once you've done that, then you can grab these handlebars and see how I can stretch the handlebars out as far as I want. So now you see how in this case I have a bit of a ramp up. He goes pretty slow and then zoom, zips across the screen right at the end. Now what we're doing in the graph editor is we're manipulating the already existing keys. It's a lot easier typically to alter existing keys than it would be to go through and add a bunch of keyframes to get the same results. Okay? So let's say in this case, I decided I don't know how to use the graph editor. So let's say I stop that. I set this back to the default settings, and I want to recreate that kind of thing. So what I could do is I could go up to, let's say, 70, pull them back like here, and then set another key. And then this would probably give me something very similar to what we just saw. And then maybe I would take this and make that flat. Okay, so I get something that's kind of similar to what we had before. But the problem with this is that I've added an extra keyframe in there, and adding an extra keyframe could cause my stuff to not be as smooth as I once had it. Okay? Or if I decided I wanted to change something in here, I have to now worry about this other keyframe kind of getting in my way of changing it. All right? So it's always best to think about the less is more. So if you can get by without having a bunch of extra keyframes, then that's what you should do. Now we used to do an assignment where we would take our ball and we would have it go down like a half pipe. That was one of our things we used to do. And the process for this is having 3 keyframes. You have one on this side of the half pipe, one on the bottom, and one on the top here. And the rest of it is all done using the graph editor. Because if you added any more keyframes in there, the ball would like go this speed and then it would slow down or speed up, and then it looked jerky. Okay? But using just the graph editor, you can create a nice little swoop in there. But again, it took time to play with it. So consider using the graph editor for this kind of stuff where you want this to happen. Now the other part of animation we have to consider is the time it takes to get from point A to point B. Right now it's taking 100 frames. Regardless of what this is doing, it still takes 100 frames to get from one keyframe to the other keyframe. That's about 3 seconds and 10 frames. If I wanted that to be shorter, I could change it inside here. Okay, so I'm going to stop this. I'm going to grab the keyframe I have in the top right. You'll see up at the top of here it says 100. That's the keyframe that's the frame that current keyframe is on, is 100. The other number is the value. Okay, so we went from -12 to +12. So this one up here is the +12, and its keyframe is at 100. So if I want to take that keyframe and shove it back a bit, I can put this back to, let's say, 50. And you can see how it moved that keyframe back to 50. And then I can go through and tweak my handlebars some more. And now this animation is going to happen obviously a bit quicker, because now we're only going between 0 and 50, or 1 and 50, instead of 1 and 100. Maybe I want to take this and put it back to 20. I'll adjust my handlebars again. Adjust this handlebar again. There we go. That one just doesn't like it. And that's as slow as it can go to get there. Okay, but again, you can see how I can manipulate this just using the graph editor. Not deleting keyframes, not playing with anything else, not adding more keyframes. It's just tweaking stuff inside the graph editor. It's a very powerful tool. There's even people, I'm going to delete my keyframes here, who what they do is that they set one keyframe. So I'm going to just set one keyframe here. There's my one keyframe. And if I just set this to set this to 1 and -12, that's my first keyframe. Then I can use stuff like the insert there it is, insert keys tool, and I could just add my own keyframes and then manipulate where those keyframes are at. And there are some animators who don't do anything out in the real world. They do everything right inside of the graph editor. They're like, okay, well, I have this. I want it to maybe do this at this point and have this come in down here. I'm going to have it ramp backwards and then shoot up. That might be kind of cool. Nope, I got to have it do a little bit quicker than that. I'll move this here. Maybe I'll have it sit for a little bit. Then I'll start to play with these. Come on. That's one thing about the graph editor, is that if you get too close to these handlebars, it just doesn't like it.
What do you do if you want to move one of the individual handlebars?
There's a breaking thing. It is this one. So we can break it, and then we can snap that back.
What's an easy way to make them longer and shorter?
That's just this curves weighted tangents, and then that free tangent weight. There we go. Okay, so I can do everything basically inside the graph editor, or I can do everything outside the graph editor. It just depends on your own individual workflow. I prefer doing stuff outside. I think I have a little bit more control of it out there. But that's just me. As you start to develop your own style, you'll have your own way that you want to work on your stuff. All right. So I'm going to reset this back to where we had it a second ago. Delete those keyframes. Okay, so now we're back to essentially what we had before. I'm going to just make this like that. I need to free this one. Free that one. There we go. That one got stuck. I had to redo it. Okay. So now what I want you to do is I want you to rewind your animation all the way back to frame 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this sphere. Okay? So we're not just going to hit Control D. Hitting Control D doesn't duplicate the animation. You see, he just stays there. What I want to do is duplicate the sphere with the animation. So under Edit, we're going to go to Duplicate Special option box. Okay, and we're going to duplicate the input graph. Duplicating the input graph will duplicate the sphere and anything that's connected to the sphere, like the animation. Okay, so we duplicate special, and what I want to do is move the sphere above it. So basically, like right on top of it. So if I just punched in 2 for the translate Y, it'll be right on top of it. Okay, so duplicate special, put the sphere on top of the other sphere, and then do that again a couple times, like 5 times.
Do you do that one more time?
Yep, I'm going to go to Edit, Duplicate Special option box, make sure Input Graph is clicked, and then just add 2 to that translate Y. Okay, on the 2016 folder, we want to right-click it and we want to cut it. We want to go into our folder on the P drive, and we want to paste it right into our 2540 folder. That way our preferences are now being saved into that 2540 folder. So when we come in next time, we can just reload those preferences and we don't miss a beat. We still have everything that we set up today next class. So we don't need to reset up our shelf or reset up some of the animation preferences. Okay?
What am I copying?
Your 2016 from the P drive. And then putting that inside your folder. Now, if you have multiple classes, like if you have the modeling class in this class, or you have the rendering class in this class, you may want to just have one preference folder and maybe multiple shelves, but you will have to manage kind of like your frames per second or other options that you have set up in there. Okay, so just be aware of that. Now, your 2016 folder should be backed up. we didn't really do anything crazy today, but you should still back it up. So if you have an external, you can plug it in, drop your whole folder on there, and you should be good to go. Okay? For next week, starting on